This week on QDL, we look at apprenticeship programs. Decades ago, they were common in many or maybe even most industries in the United States, and then apprenticeships largely disappeared. But they have made a comeback. They are making a comeback, and today we talk to Nicholas Wyman, CEO and founder of IWSI America, about apprenticeship programs and how they are helping address today's skilled labor shortages. Join us in 30 seconds. Welcome back to QDL. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making news in the world of quality. I'm Dirk Ducharme, Editor-in-Chief of Quality Digest. We hear a lot today about the skills gap. Employers tell us, even within our industry, that it is hard to find people with the skills they need for their particular industry. In part, this is because neither high schools nor colleges and universities are graduating students with industry skills, the required industry skills, and in part because, honestly, we as a society have pushed children to seek higher education, even sometimes when many would rather work in the trades or even in some sort of manufacturing job. So this skills gap used to be filled by apprenticeship programs. I mean, if you talk to your father or your grandfather, they will tell you about apprenticeship programs. And while many trades still have apprenticeship programs, they largely have disappeared from manufacturing-related jobs. Thus, no pipeline for skilling up workers within industry. But that has changed recently. We've seen a big growth in apprenticeships in the last, I don't know, maybe decade. And so it's changing. So here with us to talk about today's modern apprenticeships is Nicholas Wyman, CEO and founder of IWSI America. Nicholas, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Dirk, great to be here, and thanks for having me on the program.
No problem. So before we get into apprenticeship programs and what's going on with them, why don't you tell us a little bit about IWSI and what you guys are doing there?
Yeah, so we're a 501c3. Our mission is simple: to help connect employers with a pipeline of skilled labor. So we work on varying programs. We assist governments develop programs to really help employers take that next step. And during our conversation today, I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the things that employers can do to take our conversation today and turn that into starting an apprenticeship program.
Now, are there certain industries that are being harder hit by the skills gap than others? Does it seem to be concentrated in certain types of industries?
Yeah, well, what's actually going on, if we look at a level above that, larger than the state that you're in, globalization and technological change are putting pressure on all industries. Everyone is having to rethink the way that they're skilling up their businesses. The labor pipeline, the way that people used to bring people into their companies, no longer works. So there really isn't any industry that is not suffering from a lack of skilled workers.
Now, you've mentioned earlier, and in some readings I've done on some stuff that you've said, you mentioned that you don't think that either schools or even on-the-job training is keeping in sync with kind of the evolving employee needs. Now part of that I can understand, the school part of it. I understand that schools in particular, for a variety of reasons, are kind of lacking behind on training for the necessary skills. But I'm kind of surprised that you mentioned out of sync within the companies themselves, because I would think on-the-job training would help address that to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, I think that it's really it's a problem that needs to be resolved by government, business, educators coming together. The idea that one group can solve this problem alone is something that my writing and research says it really needs to be done in a collaborative nature. When we were younger, when I was younger, certainly, getting some work experience was a lot easier than it is now. Unfortunately, now we've got things like insurances, which make some employers a little less inclined to allow people to really immerse themselves and see what it's like to work in a particular industry. So if there's work experience available, at the school district, which you're working in or living in, I mean, that's fantastic. But we have seen a lot of companies who it's really just say to a group of students, look, stand behind this yellow line and look over there, and that's where the work's being done. That's not enough for a person to decide if that's the industry they want to be in. Also showing people videos or saying, you really need to immerse yourself. And the idea of apprenticeship is that you can learn and earn. So it's a combination of classroom and field-based related instruction. So it's a real opportunity.
Now, is this, you call it kind of modern apprenticeship programs, and I kind of mentioned in my lead-in here, obviously my father and certainly my grandfather, I'm sure your father and grandfather, I mean, apprenticeship programs were kind of very normal, and I know the same was true in Australia and the UK. Apprenticeship programs were very popular up until maybe, I don't know, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and then they seemed to wane. Now they're making a comeback. Is there a difference between today's apprenticeship programs versus the apprenticeship programs of yore?
Oh, look, absolutely. I noticed you picked up the Australian accent there.
Yeah, couldn't miss it.
Yeah, so somebody asked me last week, they thought it might have been from the Appalachian Mountains, and I said, it's actually Australian. So I did an apprenticeship in culinary arts. So I left school. My father was an academic, and I knew the industry that I really wanted to learn and develop in. But I think what we've seen, apprenticeship, as you alluded to before, is the Western world's oldest form of learning. But it really has had to reboot and refresh to keep up with modern times. Some traditional apprenticeships go for up to 4 years. Aeronautical engineering is actually 5 years, and that should actually be 6 years. I think people working on aircraft, we want them to do a very long apprenticeship. But for instance, automotive technology, this is people who are servicing a vehicle. We don't mind if these apprenticeships are a little bit shorter in duration. So there's really a refresh on the way that apprenticeships are being delivered. In Australia, on a population of 23 million, we have about 500,000 apprentices. So per head of population, that's a lot of apprentices. Yeah. In the US, as you've mentioned, in the last couple of years, there's really been a lot of renewed interest. Somebody asked me the other day, is this a fad? Is this just because it's popular at the moment? If you look to Europe, you look to Germany, and probably leading, people talk a lot about German apprenticeships. Look at Swiss apprenticeships. I mean, these really are ingrained into how companies bring people into the world of work. And the types of apprenticeships are actually expanding. So 5 or 10 years ago, if you asked someone on the street, what do you know about apprenticeship? They would have had a fairly narrow view. They would have said this is something for building construction. People might have said, is that something to do with a television show that the president used to run? Something like that. But what people really need to understand is that apprenticeships now can be taken in a whole range of different pathways. So we're seeing a much broader range of what might be being able to undertake an apprenticeship with.
Well, these apprenticeship programs, are these largely, how do I say it? How are they distributed? Are these like kind of the traditional vocational school kind of third-party apprenticeships? Are they apprenticeships within companies where a company will hire on, some employees and bring them into apprenticeship program and train them up? Are they coming from universities? I mean, what's the mix there?
Yeah, so the traditional way to take on an apprentice was that an employer would have that desire, and they go off and in the state or which they're working, they'd register. Usually there are unregistered apprenticeships, but I'm talking here about apprenticeships which are federally registered. More recently, there's intermediary organisations. I've been doing a lot of work in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And there's a number of organisations there, including workforce boards, who are helping small to medium companies get into apprenticeship. But there's no question that there are reasons why employers haven't, jumped into apprenticeship programs. They're concerned about handing over too much information during registration. They're concerned about the red tape of registration process. So there are some barriers. So the good news is there is help available to companies who want to set up or establish an apprenticeship program.
Yeah, I was going to get to that in a little bit. So let's jump to that question right now. So if a company within an industry, let's say machinists, because that's a large part of our audience. We have a lot of machinists. So let's say a company wants to start, apprentice CNC operators or machinists. How would they get started in this? I mean, is there a resource they can go to, or do they just decide to start bringing in people and training them up? I mean, what and I'm sure there's a cost for that. So I mean, what are their resources if somebody really thinks this is valuable for them and they want to get started with it?
Sure. So I think it's really about doing some research, and the critical question, the first number one question an employer needs to ask is, what is our skills need? You were quite specific there where you were talking about a particular occupation, and I think that's a great place to start. Sometimes people dilute the focus. They try to launch 6 or 7 different occupations, and it's much better off that you focus on the most critical skills need, and then you build a program backwards from that. So you're not building a program around philanthropy or to build to plug a hole that you might have in your organisation today or tomorrow. This is where you're saying, we're going to develop a program. We're going to have within our organisation, we're going to have rock solid support from the CEO or the board down. It really needs to have rock solid commitment from the company, because you're not just putting an employee into a job and hoping that works out. You're actually designing a program. You then need to look into elements which you're going to need to run that program successfully. So you have a decision to make about whether you're going to register that program federally, which I would strongly recommend, because for the reasons of this age of globalization, I think it's the responsible thing to do to make sure that the person entering the apprenticeship program ends up with a nationally recognised certification. And then you need to start thinking about the type of education. So you can talk to community college, private training providers, or you can seek out in your area or the region that you work in, is there an intermediary, or is there someone who can offer some technical assistance, somebody who might have done that before? And I often a consortia, because in the area where your company might operate, there may be other companies who are facing exactly the same skill shortage, and you're actually not competing with each other. You're actually competing offshore, and so it makes sense to bring your effort together and use some economies of scale. So there isn't a one size fits all, or there isn't, as it were, a silver bullet that's going to answer this, but you need to do your homework. You need to do some research. There's plenty of resources available on our website. There's also a site called the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. that has a whole page dedicated to apprenticeship. The Federal Department of Labor in Washington has a really good site. People do need to take on board the information. It is the internet. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true.
Right.
So you've kind of got to sift through that.
How would you? One of the companies that we talk to a lot is Newport News Shipbuilding, which has got a very old and long-running apprenticeship programs. And talking to the director of that over there, he brings up a point which they just deal with, but I'd be interested in your perspective on it. Is he says, hey, one thing that does happen is we'll invest time and money and energy to train up our apprenticeships. We get our apprentices. We get them really good. They become journeymen, and then they leave and go somewhere else and take those skills with them, they look at that as like, well, okay, well, we're helping industry, and yeah, we've lost that particular person, but that's the way it goes. How would you look at that perspective? I mean, is that a risk when companies invest in an apprentice, that now that they've trained him up, that apprentice may just go somewhere else?
Yeah, well, look, this is always a risk, and particularly retailers. If we went back a decade or two, you had the large chain stores who really questioned the idea of setting up, not apprenticeships as such, but we're just talking about, they had very high quality training programs. And then they realized that they were training up people for the mall stores. And I think that you really have to, I've looked at, this is interesting, in Southeast Asia, they have this thing called the golden handcuffs. They try and tie people to companies after they've actually completed their training. In other words, there'd be some sort of bond or something like this. And my advice is, compelling people to stay and work for you is not a great workforce strategy. So I think you need to look at your company and say, okay, a person has completed their training. What sort of career progression? What are some of the things that we can do to keep that employee engaged? Absolutely, you will get people who, for circumstance of family, they might have to move to a different location or something like that. But if it's simply a cultural thing, I think in the program design, you really need to say, how can we attract these people and how can we retain them? So that idea of retention shouldn't just be for the duration of training. It should be a long range view. Interesting, you talk about the shipyards. I wrote a piece. I write a monthly blog for Forbes, and I wrote a piece only about a month or two ago about that program. And there's a lot of elements in that program that somebody thinking of starting their own apprenticeship program could most definitely take from that.
Yeah, great program. So you mentioned earlier, some people look at, our apprenticeship programs, are they a fad? Are you seeing, or have we seen a resurgence? Are apprenticeship programs growing pretty rapidly?
Look, absolutely. Programs are growing. I do go to a lot of conferences, and I must say, quite often there's just not enough employers for apprenticeship programs to work. The secret sauce is employers. This is not a training program that you then go and find this person a job. That's, that's a train and place type of program. An apprenticeship program is where the employer is absolutely at the table, from the commencement. And that is an absolute critical element. But as far as growth in number of programs, my only caution there is that in the speed to grow numbers, we constantly have to keep in the back of our mind for these programs to have longevity and to be able to keep up with this global changing nature of work. We need to make sure that there's quality built into these programs. I have heard some people, it's interesting in the US that you can call something an apprenticeship program, but it's actually not. In the UK, in Australia, an apprenticeship program must be registered, it must have certain duration, there are quality standards. And I'm not suggesting this should be cumbersome for employers, but we want to make sure that someone doesn't have a 6-week program, they train some people, it might be a youth program, these young people take on some debt, and then this training company then tries to place these people and says, yeah, that's our apprenticeship program. Well-meaning as it may be, that's not an apprenticeship program. So we do need to ensure that there are standards. And once again, back to the DOL, there's been some projects working on some industry standards and some certifications. And that really is another key element of a successful apprenticeship program. We want to make sure that there is robust quality. Another one which is really important to a lot of people I speak to, a lot of companies, is safety. we want people to come home in the same condition they went to work.
Yeah.
So not every workplace is ready for an apprentice. There are companies who have the desire to take on an apprentice, but their workplace isn't ready. So you need to give consideration. If you're a company executive or a manager, it may be great that you have the desire to start an apprenticeship program, but is your supervisors and is your line managers ready? So maybe you need to refresh or reboot some of the training there, because this really is, as I said, it's a whole lot of different elements coming together in a coordinated way. So you need to give consideration to that.
In the final question here, if you're interested in an apprenticeship program, maybe you're a manager, you're a supervisor or something, and you think this is something that's good, but you've got to sell the higher ups on this idea. What are the immediate and long-term benefits that you can point to say, look, if we implement an apprenticeship program, or if we get involved in a third-party apprenticeship program or tie in with a university or junior college, here's the benefits that we can see to get out of that. What would those be?
So I think the first big benefit is from a cultural perspective. You're bringing someone in at an entry-level, grassroots level. So you've got to remember, they're not just during their apprenticeship learning the technical skills. And as we know, Dirk, the technical skills are going to constantly change, but they're also taking on people skills, employability skills, communication skills. So these are skills which are really going to embed themselves into the culture of the organisation. For the accounting department, there are a lot of research and reports out there. If you, plug into the internet and look at return on investment, there's information out there that puts forward a very strong case to say that investing in an apprenticeship program has a long-term return on investment. And that's an area that I touch on in the report that we've put together, which is a free resource available to companies called It's Time. So people can, get a copy of that and have a look at some of those resources.
All right, yeah, and I was just going to mention that it's time. The subtitle for that is "Using Modern Apprenticeships to Reskill America." What's in that report? If you can just kind of recap that for people, what they'll find in there.
Yeah, so it's I'm a practitioner, so I didn't follow in my father's footsteps. I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. So the programs I run, I've graduated 16,000 apprentices, and I employ today 750 apprentices directly in my own company. So I'm coming from a very practical point of view. So this report is written as a resource or a playbook for employers. The first thing is that it explains the difference between an apprenticeship, an internship, and other types of training programs. There are 5 myths in there which we dispel. Myths that may stop companies wanting to start a program, or myths which would stop a person wanting to enter an apprenticeship program. We've got some information there on return on investment, and then we also have a whole lot of different resources. And the other thing is that we've got some great case studies, and I like to always tell my stories if I'm writing for magazines and my writing. I like to talk through the eyes of people who've been there and done that, be it an apprentice or be it a company. So we spotlight some different industries. As I mentioned, I've written quite a few articles for Forbes. So there's quite a good library there. So if, particular industry, have a look there online, and hopefully there'll be some practical tips on how to take somebody's interest into actual implementation. It's taking that next step. You can't put your toe in the water. You've got to just commit yourself and do it.
All right. Well, Nicholas Wyman, CEO and founder of IWSI America, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate your time today.
Well, I appreciate your time. Thanks again. Thanks for having me on the program.
No problem. There is a link below the player page to IWSI's report that we were just talking about. It's called It's Time, Using Modern Apprenticeships to Reskill America. It's free, so click on that link, download that report, and take a look at it. That is it for today. As usual, if there is someone or something you would like us to bring on the show, let us know, and we will do our best. Just send those ideas to us at qdl@qualitydigest.com. Thanks for joining us today. We will see you next week on QDL. So long.